So, you've decided you're interested in Nikos Kazantzakis. Good choice. This is just a bit of a primer to get you started. So, a quick bio. He's a Greek author, obviously, judging by his name. Born in 1883 in Crete, died in 1957, famous during his lifetime. He was nominated for the Nobel 9 times and he never won once. In the 20s, he lost it to Camus, who thought he ought to have won. Probably the most famous Greek author behind Homer, absolutely the most famous modern one. A bunch of his most important books were republished by Faber and Faber a couple years back. They're nice, they're cheap paperbacks, so if you're getting into him, you can pretty easily start there. If you want to start reading works by Kazantzakis, no matter where you start, you ought to be prepared for the following themes: the nature of God, action versus thought, logic versus emotion, the effects of ideology, nationalism, the place of Greece in the world as opposed to other nations, the idea of struggle for its own sake, and of course, America's favorite theme, good old freedom. A lot of what Kazantzakis wrote was influenced by a huge amount of travel that he did during his life around Europe and Asia and the Middle East. In terms of ideology, he went from this sort of youthful, optimistic Bolshevism to a less extreme kind of democratic socialism over time, and that kind of shows up a lot in all of his novels as well. Enough about the man, you came for a guide on the work, so where should you start? As it turns out, that's a pretty easy question to answer. Definitely start with Zorba the Greek, full title, The Life and Politics of Alexis Zorba. Yeah, that one made into a movie in the 50s with Anthony Quinn. It was inspired by a real person Kazantzakis actually knew. And Zorba deals with all of his major themes by contrasting a diaspora and a wannabe Buddhist who's afraid to do anything without thinking about it first, returning to Crete, his ancestral homeland, with a crazy, action-obsessed man who can't resist any of the spices of life and can't stand inaction in any form. So go and read that one, because that's definitely where you should start. Now, if you got through that, you would have noticed how dramatic it was, how excessively passionate it was. Yeah, they're all like that. Kazantzakis is a broad strokes brush kind of guy. Very emphatic, emotionally driven stuff. If you like Zorba, next is Christ Re-Crucified. As Holy Week commences, a tiny rural village in the mountains on the Greek mainland decides to stage a passion play, and the young man picked to portray Jesus is put into a position startlingly like the real thing. Then, Freedom and Death, or as some translate it, Captain Michalis. It's about the Cretan revolutionaries in the 1870s. Captain Michalis is a brutish, violent, patriotic, stultifyingly traditional man who can't wait for the revolution to reach his island, and he's heavily based off Kazantzakis' actual father. The book's much angrier and much bloodier than the two previous ones. Crete was just like that. They're kind of still like that, but we'll not get into that. Next, you should go for The Last Temptation of Christ. Less violent. I think, yeah, this one was a film as well. I don't watch films, but it was with Mel Gibson. Yeah, good reinterpretation of the Passion. It gives you first century Jerusalem a color that doesn't come across in the biblical sources at all, of course. It's sort of arid and dark and permanently on the cusp of violent, bloody revolution. When I describe it like that, you kind of understand what it is, because I've just described Captain Michalis as well. It's the Greek or the Cretan understanding of an older Jewish problem. So he kind of continues that thread of, a society on the edge of explosion. Remember, you've got Kazantzakis was raised by this guy who was only slightly less insane about freedom than Captain Michalis. Freedom is going to come up a lot. So at this point, if you've read those 4 books, you've pretty much grasped the essence of it. You've got the soul of it. But if you want more, well, that's good news. I've got more for you. There's the Fratricides. Set in the early 20th century, in a small Greek village. Yeah, look, I know there are a lot of small Greek villages. Torn apart by conflict between communists and fascists. The Fratricides follows the doomed peacekeeping efforts of a Father Yanaros. Tragic and short, There's barely any plot, so it's lacking in plot elements, but it's a very clear cry of anguish. It's more emotional than it is thoughtful. Still a good read. Next is God's Pauper, St. Francis. This is basically Kazantzakis doing hagiography, a biography of St. Francis, who gives his name obviously to the order of Franciscan monks. Some might say it was stultifyingly pious. It brought tears to my eyes a couple times through the sheer emotional expression. Next, Report to Greco, autobiographical. It's a record by Kazantzakis of his early life and some of his travels in Russia, Israel and Palestine, Japan and China. More obviously philosophical than all of his other books, but of course it is, because he has to talk about why he went to certain places and what he thought about while he was there. Everything after this is really only for the super hardcore, but I'll talk about them for the sake of completion. The Rock Garden, contemplation of Asia, Asian themes. Kazantzakis tries to establish a way to live and grapples with Buddhism. He kind of integrates passages into this from another thing that he wrote, not a novel, but a book of spiritual exercises. And I'm assuming, I haven't read that, but I'm assuming it's got a fair bit to do with the early church fathers. Next, the very early novels, Serpent and Lily and Toda Raba, about his sort of early communism and the belief that the world is ending, or at least it's going in a direction from which it can't really return. Next, the two family novels, Alexander the Great and At the Palaces of Knossos. Not so interesting as the others. They're very short, they're suitable for kids, so they're far less violent, and they actually star, the protagonists, at least at the beginning, are all children, so it's suitable for children. And obviously they're about the stories of Alexander the Great and the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. Knossos is kind of more interesting than Alexander because it represents the change between your old Minoan civilization and the new Mycenaean civilization as well, but ultimately you can probably skip those. Finally, there's the modern Odyssey. 33,333 lines of verse, continuing the story of Odysseus into the modern day. It's an absolute monolith, but he actually wrote it pretty early in his career, funnily enough. I've chosen to leave it till last because I feel like the theme of it, of struggle for its own sake, and the idea of apotheosis kind of naturally lends itself to being read last and sort of to cap the whole thing off. So I'm not really sure whether that should be placed earlier in the order or not, but I guess it doesn't matter as long as you at least try Zorba.